The galaxy was burning, and everyone knew it. The station called Vorath Prime floated at the edge of contested space like an old coin lost in a dark river. Nobody truly owned it, and that was exactly the point. It had been built 300 years ago as a neutral place, a location where weapons were forbidden and voices were the only tools allowed. But voices had long since stopped working at Vorath Prime, and the station had slowly become a place where hope came to die. The Eternal Cascade was the name the historians used. The soldiers who lived inside it simply called it the Forever War. It had started over a mistranslation between the Velshera Empire and a smaller civilization called the Drath Collective. The Velshera were proud beyond measure. Pride in their culture was not a personality trait but a biological function, something written into their very blood. And when the Drath ambassador had accidentally used a word that meant servant-born in the old Velshera tongue instead of starborn, the insult had landed like a blade through the heart of the Empire. The Velshera had responded with fire. The Drath had called for allies. And the allies had called for more allies, until the whole galaxy was pulling on the same burning rope. By the time humanity found its way to the stars and earned its seat at the Galactic Conclave table, the war had already consumed 4 civilizations entirely. 3 more were on their knees. The Conclave itself was fractured. Ambassadors had been sent to Vorath Prime 17 times in the past century to negotiate with the Velshera, and 17 times those ambassadors had failed. Not failed in the ordinary sense, the way negotiations sometimes just fall apart, they had been broken. The Velshera Queen, Esoviara the Eternal, had ruled for 200 years and had made it her personal art form to dismantle anyone who sat across from her. The first human ambassador, a brilliant woman named Director Calla Reeves, had lasted 40 minutes before her own mind turned against her under the weight of Velshera psychological projection technology. The second had walked out of the chamber unable to speak for 6 days. The third had simply refused to board the shuttle and submitted his resignation the same afternoon. The Conclave's message to Earth was quiet but urgent. Send someone, or humanity loses its seat at the table entirely. The Earth Council met for 11 hours. They reviewed generals, admirals, seasoned diplomats, celebrated politicians, philosophers, linguists, and 3 separate individuals who had been called the greatest negotiator alive by different news sources. Every name they examined had something attached to it. A record of military thinking, a tendency toward confrontation, a history of winning by making the other side lose. None of those qualities would survive 5 minutes in a room with Esoviara the Eternal. Then a junior researcher named Pell dropped a paper file on the table, actual paper, which made 3 council members look up in surprise, and said, quietly, "There is one more. Name." The file belonged to Elias Cord. Elias Cord was 54 years old and lived in a small town in northern Canada called Redfern. Population 1,200. Mostly stubborn people who grew things and fixed things and argued loudly at community meetings about road repairs. He had spent 30 years working as a crisis negotiator, first for local law enforcement, then for a private mediation firm that handled impossible cases, the kind where both sides had already stopped believing a solution existed. His record was remarkable in a very quiet way. He had resolved 231 crisis negotiations in his career, and he had never lost a single life on his watch. Not the man on the bridge in Thunder Bay who had been standing there for 6 hours. Not the armed family in a farmhouse outside Winnipeg that 3 previous negotiators had given up on. Not the 14-year-old girl in a shopping centre in Montreal who had been threatening everyone around her because she was terrified and alone. He had sat with all of them. He had listened to all of them. He had not once raised his voice. His personal file noted that he had lost his wife, Maya, to a random act of violence 8 years ago. A wrong place, wrong time situation involving a man who had simply stopped coping with his pain and made a terrible choice. Elias had not become bitter, he had become quieter. The council read the file in silence. "He has never negotiated anything with a military or political dimension," said one member. "No," said Pell, "but he has never lost anyone either." They sent him. Elias received the call on a Tuesday morning while he was fixing a broken fence post in his backyard. He listened, asked 3 clarifying questions, said he would need to pack a bag and find someone to feed his cat, and agreed to be at the transport hub in 6 hours. The briefing on the shuttle to Vorath Prime was delivered by a young Conclave officer named Lieutenant Sarah who looked like she had not slept in 3 days. She explained the Velshera, their culture, their technology, and their queen with the intensity of someone reciting a list of reasons why everything was already over. She explained the psychological projection devices installed in the Grand Chamber, machines that took whatever anxiety already lived in a person and turned it into something unbearable. She explained that Esoviara had a gift for reading the fears of other species and pressing on them with surgical precision. She explained that the sonic architecture of the chamber itself was designed to produce a low vibration that made most living creatures feel a creeping and wordless sense of danger. Elias listened with his hands folded around a thermos of coffee. When Sarah finished, there was a pause. "Any questions?" she asked. "Is there a place to refill this on the station?" Elias asked, lifting the thermos. Sarah stared at him. "The coffee," he said. "I go through about 3 of these on a long day." She stared for another moment, then said, very carefully, "I can check." Elias nodded and looked out the viewport at the stars. He did not look afraid. He did not look excited or brave or full of resolve. He looked, Sarah thought, like a man on his way to a meeting he had already attended 100 times before in slightly different rooms. Vorith Prime appeared ahead of them through the viewport, a long silver station turning slowly in the dark, lit from within by the glow of a dozen civilizations all trying very hard not to destroy each other. Elias finished his coffee. He picked up his bag. He stood. "Let's go sort this out," he said. The Grand Chamber of Vorith Prime had been designed by architects who understood fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from darkness or loud noise. Those were crude instruments. The Velshera had studied fear the way a musician studies an instrument, with patience, with precision, and with a deep love for what it could produce when played correctly. The chamber's walls were alive with slow-moving bioluminescent light, shifting between colors that the Velshera had identified as universally unsettling across 47 carbon-based species. The gravity in the room was set just slightly wrong, not enough to notice immediately, but enough that after 10 minutes the body began to feel the floor was not entirely trustworthy, and beneath all of it, beneath the light and the gravity and the enormous carved ceiling that showed Velshera. Victories going back 8 centuries, there was the sound. It was not a sound anyone could hear. It lived below hearing, below the point where ears could catch it. It was felt in the chest, in the back of the jaw, in that ancient part of the brain that still remembered when predators existed. Every species that had ever sat in this chamber reported afterward a deep and wordless sense that something was wrong, that they were in danger, that the correct response was to run. The Velshera delegation entered first. They were tall, nearly 8 feet, with skin the color of deep water and eyes that caught light and held it, and they moved the way all predators moved, without wasted motion, with total awareness of the room. There were 9 of them, arranged in a formation that put the smallest directly behind the largest, which was the Velshera signal that lethal protection was being offered. The smallest one in the back was always the most dangerous. At the center of the formation sat Soviara the Eternal. She was not the tallest of her delegation, but she was the most present, the kind of presence that filled a room not by being loud but by making everything else in the room feel slightly less real by comparison. She wore no crown. Velshera queens considered crowns to be decoration for rulers who were not certain of their authority. Instead, she wore the marks of her reign carved in thin silver lines across her face and throat, 200 years of recorded history written directly onto her body. She looked at the empty chair across the table. She waited. The door opened, and Elias Cord walked in. He was carrying his thermos. Sarah had found a refill station, as promised, and a small notebook made of actual paper, which he set on the table in front of him without ceremony. He pulled out the chair, sat down, uncapped the thermos, and took a slow drink. Then he looked up at Soviara with the calm, open expression of a man who had just sat down for breakfast. There was a pause in the chamber. The Velshera translator, a thin figure wrapped in silver cloth, leaned toward Soviara and whispered something. Soviara's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, a small recalibration, the way a hunter adjusts when the prey does something unexpected. She activated the projection system. The effect was immediate, or it should have been. Every previous ambassador had responded within 90 seconds. Sweat, fidgeting, a tightening of the jaw, a change in the eyes. The machine's red anxiety and fed it back amplified, and anxiety, in any species, had a way of growing into panic when left in a closed loop. Elias took another drink from his thermos. He opened his notebook and wrote something in a steady hand. The Velshera delegation exchanged a look. Soviara increased the output. Elias looked up, glanced briefly at the ceiling as though he had heard a faint sound, then looked back at his notebook and kept writing. The sonic frequency was now at the level that had caused the second human ambassador to weep openly within 4 minutes. It pressed against the ribcage like a firm hand. It spoke to the older parts of the brain in a language made entirely of dread. Elias paused, tilted his head slightly, and then reached into his bag. He produced a small item, orange, soft, and set it on the table next to his notebook. It was, the Velshera translator would later confirm after an extended analysis, a piece of foam that humans inserted into their ears when they did not wish to hear something. He had brought earplugs. He had read the briefing documents. He had read the full section on subsonic architecture, and he had, apparently, packed accordingly. He did not put them in. He simply set them on the table, visible, as though to acknowledge that he was aware of the system and had prepared for it but was willing to sit without protection as a gesture of good faith. It was, without question, the most devastating diplomatic move anyone had made in the Grand Chamber in 50 years, and he had done it without saying a single word. Esoviyara turned off the projection system. She studied him for a long moment, not with hostility, but with the focused attention of someone encountering something genuinely new. In 200 years of rule, in 17 sessions with human and non-human ambassadors alike, she had never once seen anyone do that. Then she spoke in the formal Velshera tongue, and the translator rendered it into the common language through the chamber speakers. "You are the representative sent by the human world." "I am," said Elias. "You are a negotiator." "I have been for a long time, yes." "You are not." "Afraid." Elias considered this with the same seriousness he gave every question, and the pause lasted just long enough to show he was actually thinking about it. "I have been afraid many times," he said. "I have just learned that being afraid does not mean you have to act afraid." Esoviyara was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, then she looked at the notebook on the table, at the thermos, at the earplugs still sitting there in plain sight. Then, and this had never happened before in any session at Vorith Prime, she asked a personal question. "What is your name?" "Elias Cord," he said. The translator stopped. The sound in the chamber changed, not because of any machine, but because every Velshera in the room had gone completely still at exactly the same moment, as though a single switch had been thrown in all of them at once. One of the guards put a hand on the weapon at his side, then stopped himself, very deliberately. Another made a small and sharp sound that was quickly silenced. Esoviyara had not moved, but the color beneath her deep-water skin had shifted, something moving through her like a slow current, visible only at the edges where her skin met the silver lines of her history. She stared at Elias. He looked back at her, his pen still resting lightly against the notebook, the same calm on his face that had been there since he walked in. "Should I spell it?" he asked. Nobody answered. The Grand Chamber of Vorith Prime, which had been built for the sole purpose of making others afraid, was holding its own breath for the first time in 8 centuries, and for the first time in anyone's memory, the most powerful queen in the known galaxy looked at the man across the table and felt something she had not felt since she was very young. She felt uncertain. And uncertain, Elias Cord had learned in 30 years of sitting with people at the edge of things, was the most hopeful thing a person could be. The session was suspended within 2 minutes of Elias giving his name. The Velshera delegation withdrew in a formation so tight they moved as a single body, Esoviyara at the center, her guards folded around her like a closing hand. The chamber doors sealed behind them with a sound like a held breath finally released, and the Grand Chamber was left with only Elias, Lieutenant Sarah, and a junior conclave aide who had gone the color of old paper. "What just happened?" Sarah said. "I don't entirely know," Elias said, and he picked up his earplugs and dropped them back into his bag. "But she asked my name and then everyone reacted like I had said something that mattered, so now we wait and find out what it was." "That could be a threat." "It could be," he agreed, "but threats don't usually make people go still. Fear makes people go still, and fear and threat are different things. Whatever my name meant to her, it scared her, and scared is actually a very workable starting point." He asked Sarah to find him something to eat. She came back 15 minutes later with a nutrition packet designed for conclave staff, which Elias examined with the expression of a man who had been promised dinner and received a pamphlet. He ate it anyway, sitting on the edge of the table, writing in his notebook in the same steady hand he had used in front of the Queen. On the other side of Vorith Prime, behind sealed doors and in a room that smelled of old incense and older authority, Esoviyara the Eternal was doing something she had not done in 40 years. She was praying. Not in the way most species prayed, with hope, or desperation, or a desire for something to change. The Velshera form of prayer was a reckoning. You stood before the record of what you had done and you did not look away. Esoviyara stood before the wall of her private chamber, where the silent scriptures were etched from floor to ceiling in the original Velshera script, and she read the passage she had memorized before she could walk. He will come from a world that does not know silence. He will carry the first sound of peace in his name, and when the Queen of the Long War hears him speak it, she will know that the war is old enough to die. She said the word aloud, alone, in her own language, Cord, And in that language it was 3 syllables, and it meant the silence between 2 sounds, the pause that gave music its meaning. Her high priest, an ancient figure named Vorkale who had served 4 queens, stood behind her without speaking. When she turned to look at him, he spread his hands in the Velshera gesture that meant the text has not changed. I know what the text says, Saviara told him. Then your path is clear, my queen. My path is never clear, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not anger. It was something older and heavier than anger. I have been at war since I was given this throne. My first son died in the Cascade before he reached his 30th year. My second son refused to fight and I sent him away for it, and now I would give my entire reign to have him back at my table. The scripture says the war is old enough to die, but I have been holding it up for 2 centuries because I did not know how to set it down without my people believing I was setting them down with it. Vorkale was quiet for a long moment. A frightened man is not a prophet, Esoviara said. No, Vorkale agreed, but a coincidence of 3,000 years is difficult to call nothing. Esoviara turned back to the scripture and said nothing more. Meanwhile, in a corridor near the food dispensary, Elias had found the one person on Vorith Prime who wanted to talk to him more than anyone else, a small, quick-moving academic named Kethville, who had been attached to the conclave as a xenocultural interpreter and who had, by Elias's count, been trying to make eye contact with him since he first arrived. Kethville was of a species called the Aren, compact and warm-blooded, with large dark eyes and a voice that moved quickly as though every sentence was trying to catch up to the thought that produced it. The Aren had no involvement in the Eternal Cascade. They were scholars, mostly, and Kethville's specific obsession was human culture, which he had studied for 20 years without ever actually meeting a human. You brought paper, Kethville said, falling into step beside Elias with the energy of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say something. A physical notebook. I have read about this. Humans in high-pressure situations sometimes use physical writing as an anchoring behavior. The tactile sensation grounds the nervous system. Is that why you? I just like the way it feels, Elias said. Kethville wrote this down immediately. Elias looked at him sideways. You study humans. For 2 decades, yes, your literature especially. The concept of the narrative arc, the way human stories always insist that individual choices matter even inside systems designed to grind individuals down. It is genuinely unlike anything produced by any other known culture, your tragedies especially. What do you know about the Velshera prophecy? Elias asked. Kethville stopped walking. What do you know about it? He asked. Back. I know my name caused a problem in there, Elias said, tilting his head in the direction of the Grand Chamber. And I know that the Queen looked at me like she had just recognized something she had only ever read about, so tell me what she read. Kethville told him. He explained the silent scriptures and the 3,000-year history of the foretold figure known in the ancient text as Cord, the one who would carry peace in his name. He explained that Esoviara had been raised on this prophecy the way humans were raised on old stories of heroes and saints. Her mother had passed it down, and her mother's mother before that. He explained that the arrival of Cord was meant to signal not a defeat but a release, a permission, written in advance, for the Queen of the Long War to finally let the weight go. When he finished, there was a pause. Elias looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the universe had a very specific sense of humor. He was quiet for a long enough time that Kethville began to worry he had said something wrong. Then Elias said, that is either the most convenient coincidence in the history of the galaxy, or names just mean what people need them to mean when the time is right. Kethville opened his notebook. Which do you believe? Elias thought about it honestly. I believe that she was all ready. Looking for a reason to stop, he said. I think a lot of people in that room were, and I think sometimes all a reason needs to be is real enough to hold on to. My name was real enough. He looked at Kethville directly then, and his voice stayed the same quiet level it always held. What does Esoviara actually want? Not as a queen, but as a person. Kethville opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He had written 40 academic papers on the Velshera Empire. He had read every recorded transcript of Esoviara's public addresses. He had analyzed her tactical choices, her proclamations, the specific language she used when speaking to her generals versus her people. He had spent 20 years building a detailed picture of who she was. He had never once thought to ask that question. I don't know, he said. Find out, said Elias, and he turned and walked back toward the chamber, thermos in hand, notebook under his arm, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had learned long ago that the most important information in any difficult situation was almost never the information anyone thought to collect. Kethville stood in the corridor and stared after him. Then he turned around and went to find out. The private session began at the 3rd hour of Vorith Prime's night cycle, when the station's lights dimmed to a cool grey and most of the delegations had retreated to their quarters. It had been Elias who asked for it. A note passed through Kethville to Esoviara's sealed chamber, and it had been phrased not as a negotiating demand but as a plain and simple request. I think we should talk without the room listening, not about territory or treaties, just talk. Esoviara had read the note 3 times. Then she had told Vorkale to send a reply that said yes. They met in the grand chamber, but it was different at night. The bioluminescent walls had cooled to a low blue-white that fell across the room like moonlight over still water. The gravity was still slightly wrong, but in the quiet it felt almost peaceful, like sitting on a gently rocking boat. Elias had brought his thermos. Esoviara had brought nothing, and she sat across from him with her hands flat on the table as though to show they were empty. Kethville sat in the far corner, just close enough to translate if needed, just far enough to feel invisible. For a long moment nobody said anything. Elias poured from his thermos, and the smell of coffee filled the chamber, warm and dark and entirely out of place in a room that had been built for confrontation, and entirely welcome for that exact reason. It smelled like a kitchen. It smelled like morning somewhere ordinary. Several of the Velshera guards stationed outside the sealed doors later reported that they could smell something unfamiliar through the vents and found it, against all expectation, calming. In my culture, Elias said, without preamble and without apology, when 2 people have something hard to talk about, sometimes one of them starts by talking about something else entirely, something personal, something that has nothing to do with the problem. It sounds like a waste of time, but it is actually the most efficient thing you can do, because it tells the other person that you are a human being before you are a position. Esoviara watched him with her unreadable eyes. My wife's name was Maya, Elias said. She liked the cold. We lived in a place where winter lasted 6 months and she thought that was the correct amount of winter. Not enough winter, she used to say, is a character flaw in a place. She was killed 8 years ago by a man who was in pain and had no idea what to do with it. I don't think he meant to destroy her. I think he simply ran out of other options in his head, and the worst option was the one closest to hand. He looked at the table. I didn't become a different person after that. I didn't grow angrier or colder, but I became very aware that most of the terrible things people do to each other are not done out of evil. They are done out of exhaustion, people who have run out of road. Esoviara was perfectly still. You have been at war for 300 years, Elias said. Not you personally. You inherited it, but you carry it, and it shows, not in the marks you chose, the ones underneath those, the ones that come from holding something for far too long. A silence moved through the chamber. Then Esoviara spoke, and her voice was different from how it had sounded in the formal session, lower and older, with a weight in it that the ceremonial register had been carefully covering. My first son was named Velkaran, she said. He believed the war could end within his lifetime. He went to the front lines of the Drath border not because I sent him, but because he chose to go. He believed that if a prince of the Empire fought alongside the common soldiers, the soldiers would fight harder and the war would end sooner. He died in a border skirmish that was not even a real battle. It was a patrol clash. Someone was in the wrong place, both sides opened fire, and when it was over my son was on the ground. She looked at the table. He was 31. I'm sorry, Elias said. The 2 words sat in the air between them, simple, small, entirely without strategy behind them. And Esoviara looked at him the way a person looks at something they are checking for honesty. She looked for a long moment, then she looked away. I have a second son, she said, very quietly. He refused to fight. He told me the war was built on a lie and he would not die for a lie. I sent him away from the court, away from the Empire, because in those days I could not tolerate a voice that said what I already feared was true. I thought of it as weakness. Now I think of it as the only honest thing anyone close to me ever said. Elias did not speak. He held the space the way he had learned to hold it, not filling it, not rushing toward the silence with words to cover it up. After a time, Esoviara continued. The war began, she said, because of a word. A Drath ambassador used a phrase that in our tongue means born lesser, servant blood, an insult so deep in our history that there is no equivalent in most languages. He did not know this. In his own language, the phrase meant gifted, star-touched. It was intended as a compliment to the Empire. Elias did not react with surprise. He kept his face open and still. Our queen at that time, my ancestor, could not accept that it was a mistake. To accept it would have meant acknowledging that the war had been started over an error. And as the years passed and the dead began to accumulate, the error became impossible to name, because to name it would have been to say that every person lost had been lost for nothing. She stopped. So instead, Elias said, very quietly, more lives were spent protecting the meaning of the ones already gone. Yes. He nodded. Slowly, I had a case once, he said. 2 brothers. One had borrowed the other's truck, scratched the side door, and didn't say anything about it. The other found out and felt lied to. Felt like the scratch didn't really matter, but the silence did. Like it meant his brother didn't respect him. And it grew. Over 4 years it grew until there were guns in the farmhouse and a burned fence post and 3 police calls. And when I finally sat with both of them, the brother who had scratched the truck said, very quietly, that he hadn't told the truth because he was afraid his brother would think less of him. And the other one completely fell apart, because all he had wanted, for 4 years, of burning and fighting and hating, was to know that his brother had been afraid of losing him. HFY was watching him with an intensity that had no hostility in it. The damage was real, Elias said. The burned fence was real, the guns were real, the years they lost were real, but the thing underneath all of it was just someone who was afraid to go first. He was quiet for a moment. Somebody always has to go first. In 30 years of doing this work, that is the only thing I know for certain. Peace is not a place that appears when the fighting stops. It is a choice that one person makes before anyone else is ready, and then it either holds or it doesn't, but nothing moves until someone decides to move first. He looked at her directly. I'll go first, if you need me to. The chamber was so quiet that the ventilation in the walls was audible. HFY the Eternal, Queen of 200 years, ruler of an empire, carrier of a 300-year war, looked at a quiet, unremarkable man from northern Canada and was silent for a long time. And then she made a sound. It was not a sound Kethville had ever heard from a Velshera in his 20 years of study. A short, sudden, completely disarmed laugh. Not cruel, not ceremonial, not the controlled sound of a ruler demonstrating amusement. The real thing, the sound of something inside a person finally releasing its grip on something it had been holding for far too long. You are a very strange being, she said. I've been told, said Elias. She looked at him, and in her eyes, beneath the authority and the history and the silver-calf centuries on her skin, there was something that looked, in any species, exactly the same. It was exhaustion giving way. It was someone who had carried a very heavy thing for a very long time, who had just been handed, for the first time, a believable reason to set it down. Elias poured the last of his coffee. Outside the chamber, on the long silver station turning slowly in the dark, the night cycle continued, quiet and unhurried, and for the first time in 300 years, the most important conversation in the known galaxy was not about weapons or territory or ancient pride. It was about a truck and a scratch and 2 brothers who had both been afraid. The full assembly was called at dawn on the 3rd day. Every delegation at Vorith Prime was summoned to the main hall, a vast circular chamber where the flags of 41 civilizations hung from the ceiling in colors that told the history of the galaxy better than any written record. The conclave had not held a full assembly in 11 years. The last one had ended with 2 delegations attempting to physically attack each other, and the hall still carried the scorch mark near the eastern wall. As a reminder of how well that had gone, nobody knew exactly why the assembly had been called. The official notice had come from a Velshera delegation, and this alone made every other delegation nervous in a way that was different from the usual nervousness. Not the anxiety of incoming threat, but the wider and stranger nervousness of something completely unknown approaching from a direction no one had thought to watch. Delegations filed into the hall and sat in their designated rings. The first ring held the oldest and most powerful factions. The outer rings held the smaller civilizations, many of which had been pulled into the cascade not through choice but through proximity. Every seat was taken. The air in the hall had the particular weight of a moment that knew it was important. Elias sat in the human delegation seat in the second ring. Humanity was still relatively new to the conclave and had not yet earned a first-ring position, which suited Elias perfectly well. He had his thermos. He had his notebook. He looked like a man attending a meeting he expected would run long but would eventually end. Lieutenant Sarah sat beside him, rigid with the kind of anxiety that comes from standing next to a door that is about to open and not knowing what is on the other side. Do you know what she's going to say? Sarah whispered. I have an idea, Elias said. Is it good? I think so, but I have been wrong before. HFY entered last. She came without the tight protective formation she had used on the first day. Her guards were present but spaced normally, and any Velshera scholar would have recognized this immediately as a deliberate choice, a formal lowering of the threat display, performed in public, in front of every delegation in the known galaxy. It was the kind of gesture that, in Velshera culture, could not be taken back. She walked to the center of the hall where the speaker's platform rose slightly above the rest of the floor, and she stood there and let the room settle entirely before she spoke. Then she spoke. She spoke in the formal Velshera tongue first and then paused for translation, and then she repeated the full statement in the conclave's common language, a deliberate structure that meant she wanted every being in the room to hear it directly, in their own language, without intermediary, no distance, no buffer. She said that the eternal cascade had begun in the 3rd century of her empire's current age, a fact known to all. She said it had begun with an exchange between a Velshera queen and a Drath ambassador, also known. But what had not been spoken, she said, not in all the centuries since, was that the incident that ignited the war had been a misunderstanding between 2 languages, that her ancestor had known this within the first decade of the conflict and had chosen pride over truth, and then watched as the dead made the truth impossible to speak. The hall did not breathe. She said she could not speak for what her ancestor had chosen. Each generation owned its own decisions and could not undo what came before, but she could speak for herself, for her empire, and for 200 years of a reign she had used to sustain what should have been ended long before she was born. She said that she was ending it now. She said that wars outlive their reasons when pride is given more value than life, and that she had allowed this war to continue beyond any justification because she had not known how to stop without it feeling like surrender. She said she now understood the difference between surrender and release, and that the difference was enormous, and that she wished she had understood it sooner. Then she looked directly at the Drath delegation in the first ring, old enemies, still as stone, and she said, in the plain and unornamented phrasing that the Velshera reserved for their most sincere communications, that she was sorry. Not as a strategy, not as an opening position in a trade, simply as a true thing, spoken at last, after 300 years of not being spoken. The hall held the silence for a long time. The Drath lead ambassador was a figure named Relsover, who had been alive for the entirety of the war and who had long since stopped expecting to hear those words from a Velshera queen. She sat very still. The entire Drath delegation sat very still. Then Relsover stood. She said, in the common tongue, that the Drath accepted the acknowledgement and offered one in return, because 3 centuries of retaliation did not leave clean hands on any side, and she had known this for a long time and had lacked the same courage to say it first. It was not a clean or simple moment after that. It was not the kind of scene where everyone rushes forward into joy. Some delegations were angry, factions that had built their entire current identity around the ongoing war and had no framework for what to do with peace as a concept. One group from the outer rings walked out entirely, which Kethville, watching from the translator section, told Sarah was fine. They would return when they had finished panicking, and they did, 6 hours later, quieter and with less certainty on their faces. But the center of the thing held. Over the following 18 hours, the conclave produced what would eventually be called the Vorath Accord, not an instant end to all hostilities, which was impossible and would have been dishonest to claim, but a framework, a structured road toward the ending of active conflict and the beginning of something that at least had a direction, a real road, one with signs. Elias spent most of those 18 hours at a side table with 3 separate smaller delegations that needed someone neutral nearby while they worked through the first difficult stages, factions that had been fighting for so long they had forgotten what they actually wanted instead. He did not lead them. He did not advise on politics or territory or ancient claims. He simply sat and listened, and occasionally asked one question, a single, quiet question, that helped the people in the room remember that they were people in a room. When it was finished, the offers came. A medal from the full Conclave Council, a commendation from 3 separate governments. The Oran clans offered him a ceremonial title that translated into the common language as Speaker of Still Water. The Drath ambassador offered honorary citizenship of their homeworld. 2 galaxy-wide news organizations sent representatives to the door of his delegation suite within the same hour, both wanting exclusive access to his account of the negotiations. He declined all of it, politely, without particular deliberation, the way a person declines something they never wanted in the first place. He asked only for a ride home. Kethville found him at the shuttle dock, running at the speed of someone who had decided they were going to ask a question before the chance disappeared and was not going to let anything as minor as distance stop them. He arrived breathless, notebook already open. "Did you know," Kethville said, getting the words out between breaths, "when you gave her your name, when you said it in the chamber for the first time, did you already know what it meant? Did someone tell you about the prophecy before you walked into that room?" Elias was quiet for a moment. He picked up his bag. He looked at the shuttle that would carry him to the relay point and then home, to Redfern, to his cold northern town with its 1,200 stubborn people and his cat and the fence post in the backyard that still needed finishing? No, he said. I didn't know. Kethville looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for an answer and found the answer smaller than expected. But here is what I have learned, Elias said, and his voice was the same unhurried level it always held, the voice of a man who had sat at the edge of things for 30 years and was no longer surprised by what he found there. The right words at the right moment have a way of meaning more than the person saying them ever intended. That is not prophecy, and it is not magic. It is just what happens when someone is finally ready to hear something and something arrives for them to hear. They find the meaning they need in whatever is in front of them. I happened to be in front of her at the right time. The name was just the door. She was already standing on the other side of it. He looked at Kethville. Write that down if it helps. Kethville wrote it down. Elias stepped onto the shuttle. The door closed behind him, and the dock was quiet. Outside Vorith Prime, the stars were exactly as they had always been, ancient and vast and entirely indifferent to the small and complicated lives burning in the spaces between them. And between those stars, for the first time in 300 years, the guns were going quiet, one at a time, like lights being turned off in a house where everyone had finally, deeply, gone to sleep. The galaxy did not become peaceful overnight. It became something more honest. Then peaceful, it became tired, in the very best sense of the word, tired of the old noise, tired of the old reasons that no one alive had chosen, tired enough and brave enough to try something that none of them had ever actually tried before. And somewhere in northern Canada, on a Tuesday that smelled like cold air and coming spring, a man with a thermos and a paper notebook walked back to his backyard and finished the fence post he had started before the world called him away. He worked until the light went. He went inside. He fed his cat. The cat, for its part, was unimpressed, but it ate the food, and that was enough, and outside the window the town of Redfern was quiet and ordinary and full of stubborn people who had, as always, found a way not to destroy each other. Which was, when you thought about it, the whole point.